So I'm very glad to be joining this conversation about the future faces of spirit, and wanted to try and say things in something in broadly two parts. First of all, a sort of sense of where we're at as I see it. This is very much kind of my take on things, a sort of model, if you like, a view to offer to the conversation. I think we need lots of different models and perspectives in order that we can try and work out the next steps to take, rather than have a big overall complete system that we just somehow try and bring about. My sense of things is we need to discern a way forward very much. So that's in my mind. But I also want to particularly draw on the thought of William Blake, the poet and visionary. I live in South London, he's our local visionary. And so it feels good to draw on his spirit. He lived at the beginning of the modern period. Because of that freshness and vitality, I think, saw a lot of the things which we're still struggling with now. But as an artist, also realised that the way forward is to feel your way forward. And so I think offers good clues, which I shall try to unpack. So if there were one summary quality that I think we need, perhaps always have needed, but certainly need now, it's the capacity to listen. In a way, spiritual progress, perception, development, expansion is no more or less complicated than that. A figure who's deeply impacted me is the friend of C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, Owen Barfield. Both Tolkien and Lewis actually said that Barfield had the best ideas. And one of Barfield's rather lovely ideas is that we need to listen. And he puts it like this. He says that in the modern world, we've rather become cameras. We go around as if we're black boxes with nothing but material to possess and capture inside, trying to take sort of snapshots of reality and hold on to them. And then we flick through them in our sort of private lives, trying to go back to remember things. And we become too much like that, he thought, too much like cameras. And what we need to recover and make anew for now is a different sense, which he likens to the Aeolian harp. Aeolian harps are a bit like violin sound boxes with strings going over the top, but rather than being played, they're positioned in a window, in a doorway, and the idea is the wind moves over them, and that's what makes the music. And the image appealed to me and appealed to Barfield because it's about a combination of doing something. You've got to, as it were, tune yourself to the spirit, to the wind that's blowing over you, and position yourself in the right way in order to catch it. But nonetheless, it's a kind of co-working, a co-effort. It's about listening and tuning in, aligning. These are the kind of metaphors which I think we need. So to become more like Aeolian harps rather than slightly possessive, grabbing cameras. I think actually that this is the key quality that all great religious innovators had. If you think about it, you know, Socrates went around asking why and listening to the answers to questions. Jesus was said to have gone into the wilderness. Muhammad went into the cave. The Buddha went into the jungle. And at the end of the day, you see, this is about trusting reality. I think if spirituality is about anything, it's about trusting that there are spiritual vitalities, intelligences, beings that are intelligence and being lived amongst. And learning how to relate to that wider vision of reality is the key task. So relating and listening, tuning, aligning is going to be the way to go one way or another. But of course, that raises a lot more questions than it answers. Another early thought was that whilst there'll be lots of our own abilities and qualities that we bring to this task, you know, there are going to be psychotechnologies, there is going to be a lot of thought. We need to keep checking that it's in the service of something more than just our own struggle, because otherwise we disappear into kind of epicycles of reason, or we get caught in the latest fashion of thoughts, the latest ism, you know, the the modern, the postmodern, the meta-modern, the this modern, the that modern. These, for me, have a feeling of going round and round in circles. And I think it's because they become closed systems rather than keeping absolutely in front of us all the time, that they are ways of discerning this broader picture, this broader reality. So they must be constantly looking out rather than trying to solve and fix things within the terms of their own reference, their own consistencies. That was one sort of thought. And then the other one is that I think this can also help us to rise above the culture wars, because I think what happens with culture wars are broadly when dualistic systems of thought get going, dualistic attitudes. So we see the task really is defining ourselves against another, but that's a false sense of really having worked out something ourselves. That dualism, as well as technologies, minds, technologies becoming ends in themselves, practices becoming ends in themselves, we need to watch out for that. They need to be in the service of something greater. Now, when it comes to, nonetheless, the kind of systems of thought, practices, and so on that are around and about for us to use in the service of this greater task, in the service of this listening, this attunement, this relating, I think Christianity and Islam are going to be huge parts of any future. I, as it were, speak Christian in the sense that it's the spiritual language that I feel most fluent in, notwithstanding having drawn hugely, particularly on Buddhist and other Indian philosophies. But I think they're going to be around. I mean, that's partly just a statement of fact that now over half the world's population is either Christian or Muslim, and the indications are that's only set to grow. However, I think we need to recover a part of both those world religions, those great wisdom traditions, that is very inclined to get lost. You might say in our kind of camera take on the modern world. If it was going to be summed up in a word, it would be to recover the mystical element of those traditions, which I think is the one that's much more amenable to the listening. The mystical focuses on understanding how vitality comes from inner life and then gets projected onto external life. You might say that external systems, the ways that groups work, the ways that traditions form, are driven ultimately by their inner life, by their inner vitality. And if you don't pay attention to the psyche, the soul of the systems that you're engaged in, then the system itself will start to drive things. And I think that that's happened certainly in the West, the bit of the Christian world, say, that I see. So, you know, churches get preoccupied with their own life, their own preservation, and their own systems of thought. And it's very easy for them to get cut off from the service of the wider spiritual quest. Another thing that can happen then is that people become preoccupied with the fruits and lose touch with the roots that actually then would spontaneously produce the fruits. You know, so religious systems become very preoccupied with ethical or moral concerns, particularly when that then gets combined in the culture wars, and people are seen as, you know, not being right or true, mostly made by kind of moral, ethical assessments. I think that's a kind of neurotic reversal of fruits and roots. So people try and keep getting more energy and vitality out of producing the fruits, rather than realizing that the deeper task is to sink the roots once more. It's a kind of religiosity that goes wrong too, because I think it offers people redemption rather than freedom, if I can put it like that. This is actually an idea that Dostoevsky had when the Grand Inquisitor confronts Jesus in the famous scene from the Brothers Karamazov. And, you know, Jesus stands silently offering the freedom of silence, the freedom of harmony and alignment and attunement. And the Grand Inquisitor says, look, people don't want that. That's too much. In your life, you refused to turn the stones into bread to feed people. And that's precisely what we must do. And I think a lot of modern Western religiosity has made people very dependent, very passive, seeking redemption to kind of alleviate the sense of guilt and burden, rather than offering people freedom that really is about growth and new life. So that's one of the things which is often on my mind when I think about these things too. I mean, to put it very directly in a Christian idiom, you may know that on the morning that Jesus rises in John's Gospel and appears before Mary, almost the first thing he says to her is, "Do not cling to me. I'm sending to my God and your God, my Father and your Father." And I think that's a really crucial imperative for these really big wisdom traditions, that they say, don't cling to the figure, say, of Jesus. Realize that Jesus opened up a way which is now potentially your way too. That's something which established religions particularly tend to forget. I think often out of the best reasons. They want to help people, they want to console, they develop powerful pastoral roles, but we've got to somehow work out to push on beyond that, I think, to develop the religion which might be for tomorrow. Incidentally, I think it's in that mode that cross-traditional references, what's sometimes called the perennial philosophy, really makes sense. Because it's not about comparing and contrasting, say, doctrines or the content of religions, but it's about realizing that doctrines and the content of religions are actually symbols and channels that can communicate at their best this wider perception of reality, this spirit of things, this music and this harmony. And then they're just seen as different instruments that together might make up a kind of orchestra. So that's when, for me, the kind of cross-tradition interreligious element really works as well. When people, you might say, learn to tune their Aeolian harp, position themselves correctly, hear the spirit and make the music, that it can then build up into a harmonious whole. If you don't get that, you drop back into this dualistic thought about who's right, fixated on the content. And even with the best will in the world, it tends not to go very far. This is also actually to make the subtler point that, in a way, it's not the content of spiritual traditions, religious traditions that matter, it's what they're in service of as well. Again, it's that dynamic of how we can position ourselves to be stepping into something new rather than clinging on to what we have. The Aeolian harp, not the camera mentality. Now, maybe it'd be helpful just to say something about my own personal experience that brought me to this position such as it is. I did actually used to be a priest in the Church of England. There's a kind of backstory there, of course, but I left. And in part, I left because I did feel that Christianity, I mean, I would even say here in England, is at risk of dying. I don't think it's going to disappear. I think it's quite likely to continue as a kind of niche concern. But it's a niche concern because it's only in the groups that it makes sense. It becomes kind of inward looking, and the vitality that it definitely has is this kind of inward looking group vitality, rather than the vitality that might draw on all things into itself. It seemed to me that on the one hand, Christianity had become, you might say, too this worldly or too secular. It's become very preoccupied with material concerns, which are often very good. It's the ethical concerns that wants to look after all. But certainly in England, that doesn't really differentiate Christianity. There are many people that think like that. I work actually, my day job as a psychotherapist now, and I've worked for the NHS for many years too. The NHS employs 1.5 million people every day that is precisely looking out for everyone's well-being, delivered free at the point of need. And that is really good, don't get me wrong, but we need more. We need more than the ethical. We need a vision and a source of life and vitality that can come from outside of ourselves, that then can deliver the fruits. It's again this kind of roots fruits thing. And I think that Christianity in England anyway has forgotten that that's really its primary task. It's a risk of an established church that I think secretly feels it needs to justify its own existence when it doesn't actually speak for the many anymore. It risks putting itself up from the roots, and so dying. There's another kind of Christianity that I think is quite inclined to rush into that sense of a vacuum and need for new energy. But it's, in my mind, it risks becoming too sensational, and it becomes fixed on the peak experience, the emotional sensibility. It's the kind of religiosity that again develops its own kind of neurotic patterns, because it constantly tries to renew itself in the sense of discovering a new palpable emotional kind of religiosity. It's not the kind of religion which sinks to a deeper feeling, which is known in the still small voice, which the mystic and the visionary would draw on. And this is risky because it becomes, again, dualistic. It's about me and the positive psychology, perhaps, that can make me feel happier, make me feel more buoyant again, as if I judge that's the way to go. And it loses the deeper alignment with what in Christianity and even in the ancient Greek philosophers that I'm deeply inspired by as well, would call the logos, which is another way of putting this spiritual reality that is both within ourselves but outside ourselves as well. It's the deeper pulse, the deeper tendency, the benign, divine will that is benign towards us, but also is much more than we're at least initially aware of. And which incidentally is why Christianity always has death as part of its message, because it's that letting go and letting into the wider life, which is so important. But maybe I'll say a bit more about that later, because my main point was just to say really here at this point that I think both to this worldly religiosity and also a religiosity that's too concerned with experience is ultimately not serving us well. We need the older mystical kind of religiosity, which I will try and say more about as we go on. Yeah, maybe just to say, actually, just to finish the personal element there, that I found this actually when I went into psychotherapy and then trained as a psychotherapist myself. In a way, this was about, first of all, getting to know myself more and more, because as actually the Buddhist teacher Jack Cornfield sometimes says, you have to become a somebody before you can become a nobody. And you have to sort of know what you're clinging to in order to stop clinging to it. You have to know what you've regarded as your life before you can let go of that life to discover a wider life. And for me, it was psychotherapy, the long process of psychotherapy, many times a week in my case, which felt like the old monastic training, actually. This is the seriousness with which we must engage with these things. I mentioned that I was very influenced by ancient philosophy, ancient Greek philosophies, because I did my PhD on Plato. And one of the facts of that amazing triad of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle that I always remember is that Aristotle was taught by Plato for 25 years before he set up his own school. That is the time that we must be thinking of, I think. We're doing nothing less than rediscovering ourselves. And anyway, psychotherapy, which is often belittled because it takes a long time, I think actually is onto that wisdom. It helped me in many ways, maybe just one little indicator of that, how it opens up different dimensions of reality, was in discovering my own neuroses, my own struggles and problems in life. It actually made me realize that I'd had a life. That things did stretch back in time, even to times that I barely remembered or didn't remember it at all in my infant life. And whilst at first that was deeply disturbing, because it made me think, how on earth am I ever going to resolve these issues? It also makes you realize that there is depth in your life, there is multi-dimensional dimensions even in one life. And that in time becomes a shadow that you befriend. Because it opens up life for you, and ultimately gave me a sense of a kind of timelessness, even in my own life, my one life, because you realize that what happened many, many years ago can still be quite as impactful then as now, now as then. It doesn't, as it were, lessen off over time. It stays alive inside you. And again, whilst at first that can be really quite disturbing, ultimately it does lead you to a sense of eternity in the here and now. So it becomes a kind of blessing. It was a key thing that I realized that helped me, as it were, to drop into this third dimension, this fourth dimension of life, rather than just being kind of locked into me and my struggles, which was actually making me really quite blind, as well as everything else. I think this is not just a personal issue, though. I think it also has a kind of way of diagnosing our times more generally as well. At least an offering here. Again, it's, you know, it's one thing to bring in to try to understand our times, and that is, you know, I'm not so sure that we're living in an increasingly interconnected world. You know, one that's getting more and more complex. I'm not sure that our crises have become meta crises. When I hear that talk with the ears, when I listen to that talk with the ears of the psychotherapist, I actually hear panic. I hear neurosis, because it's the kind of thing that people who are personally struggling say. You know, they believe that their difficulties are just becoming more and more complicated, and they're more and more entangled. It's the panic of feeling they haven't got the time to fix things. That energy, the quality of listening to people speaking about our times now, for me, sounds quite similar to people speaking about their mental health problems. And so I think it's actually a symptom, not a true analysis of things. You know, things happen faster and faster when you're in a panic attack. When you've got caught up in your own world, that horrible narcissistic state where you really can't feel there's a vitality or life beyond your own preoccupation and concerns. You know, time contracts in that narcissistic state. You're completely preoccupied with tomorrow, with the future, or with the past and what's happened. There can be no present, and it's in the quiet present that reality actually expands. So, you know, the psychotherapist in me is a bit wary of analysing our times as becoming more and more interconnected and more complicated. I think that might well be a symptom, and we need to learn to kind of take a step back in order to get back in touch with reality itself. Just slightly more anecdotally, I always remember my grandmother in this too. She lived to nearly 100 years, was born at the beginning of the 20th century, so lived almost to the end. And she always used to say the first half of the 20th century was when the real novelty occurred, because she was born in an age, you know, before plastics, really before cars, certainly before planes, before electricity, all the things which appeared in the first half of the 20th century, she said really made the difference. And then things just got more speeded up in the second half. And she felt really more kind of, well, she wouldn't say neurotic, that's a psychotherapist word. But anyway, you take the point. There's maybe something of a relief to be found in the now, which is necessary before we can really begin to take steps forward. We'll need all the usual practices of the great wisdom traditions, which I think psychotherapy has helped to renew too. We'll need what Freud called the evenly suspended attention, the mindfulness that can look on, not just be caught up in. We'll need the sense that we need to discover a new awareness of our times. We'll also need that sense that we can submit to our times as well, trusting that the suffering is actually leading somewhere, when it's held and contained too, of course, in support and kindness and love. So we'll need all those things which the great wisdom traditions say, and we'll need to practice them too. We'll need to get good at them. But I think we'll need more than that as well. And this is where I come to William Blake, who I flagged off at the start, because I think William Blake realised that on top of all these qualities which we need, our will, our desire, our love, our knowledge, our awareness, we need imagination too. Imagination was the thing which for him lifted us beyond single vision, twofold vision, threefold vision, to the fullness of fourfold vision. And it's a useful thing to think about, not because I think that happens to be true, which I'll try and say so in a minute, but because it gives us a way of discerning a way forward, working with the present, with the now, not just to feel more content and happy in the now, but to be creative in the now, to move into this bigger reality, which I think is there already, but to learn to relate to it anew. So, I like Blake because he's my local visionary. Owen Barfield, who I mentioned previously, he too thought that imagination was the key issue for now. He got that from the early romantics, particularly Coleridge. He thought romanticism sort of needs to come of age, and that maybe that is going to happen now. But he realized with the early romantics, and indeed with the philosophy of Kant, that, we'll put it like this: we are imaginative creatures, whether we like it or not. We're constantly doing it all the time, every day, because it's precisely what shapes our perception. We make sense of the blooming confusion of the senses which come upon us because we have the imagination to shape them one way or another. So if that's happening anyway, Coleridge's, Barfield's, Blake's insight was that you can train that imagination and not just, as it were, let it be shaped by the times in which you happen to live, or the past that you happen to have, or the powers and principalities, you know, be they economic or any other political, that are pressing upon you and, believe you me, you know, are shaping our imagination whether we like it or not. So we must pay attention to our imaginations, partly because it's happening anyway. The imagination is making our world around us, but also because what you notice when you do start to pay attention to the imagination and how it shapes your perception of things is that you realize you don't just become more conscious of that, but you become more capable of creating new worlds, which is also discovering the worlds which are already there around us as well. And this particularly was the thing that Blake got on, and why he thought that imagination ultimately leads us to fourfold vision. It is the discovery of the reality, the consciousness, the intelligences, the beings that are around us, and entering into a kind of creative play with them, what he calls a commingling. Now, let me just say a lot more about that, because that is to really launch, in a way, to the meat of my talk, rather than just a commentary on things which no doubt you've heard many times before. Blake thought that we have 4 states of mind, 4 states of imaginative mind. And when you get these 4 different qualities of experience sort of broadly, you know, into you in some way, then you can watch what state of mind you're in any particular moment. He called them all-ro, generation, Beulah, and eternity. Now, the names in Blake are often immediately off-putting. The upside is it makes you do a bit of work in order to sort of take them on board. And that's worth doing, because then you get a feel for it yourself, and then can do this discernment of both what state you're in and what state you find yourself in, maybe in a particular group at a particular time in a particular society. And that buys you the freedom to be able to navigate to a new state of mind, a new quality of imagination. So let me see if I can sort of bring them alive for you right now. First of all ro. Actually, if you've seen any image of Blake's, you'll have seen one of Blake's most famous images of the all-ro state of mind, and it's his figure of your reason. It's the Ancient of Days, the bearded old man who leans out the sky, compasses in hand, shaping the world. And that, in a way, sums up it all, even in the name. This is the state of mind that trusts reason. It trusts generalizations. It likes to abstract from reality in rules and laws, because then it feels it has control and possession of reality. But the compasses which your reason has to measure and to assess and to generalize also limit, because any kind of generalization, any kind of abstraction takes you away from reality. Now, we all do that. I'm doing that in this talk right now. But the mistake that all-ro makes is that it confuses its abstraction and generalization with reality. It forgets it's serving something else. It adopts his camera mentality rather than the mentality of the Aeolian harp. And so it contracts reality. It's actually, Blake thought, death-loving secretly, because it wants to pull back from life in order to hold on to how it understands life. So, examples in the world around us. I think that economics often falls into this state of mind. You know, the thing that's very strange about economic reality, the economy that we serve, is that it measures the world, taking the measurements that precisely make the world that it's measuring. You know, and then it collapses it down onto one measurement, often GDP, as if GDP is somehow a whole world into which we're supposedly growing. But of course, it feels thin, it feels too small the minute you start to think about it. It feels too clunky and clumsy. I'm speaking right in the middle of the coronavirus. And sometimes when I listen to the statisticians trying to assess where we're at now, I feel there's a kind of Eurism, all-road mentality going on. Because what happens is that different statisticians come up with different models of where we're at in the crisis. And then they compete, because to make their statistical model, to make their inferences, they're having to collapse and pull back from reality. And I do wonder, you know, a bit like economics, whether they actually do us more harm than serve us, because they almost inevitably entice us to confuse the model with reality. And then when the model fails, we get disillusioned, or we get angry, we get cross. So you can feel the all-road mentality, Eurism, the gods, the deity, the power, the principality is very powerful in the world, particular times of middle of 2020, but generally the modern world too. So it has this upside of control, power, technology, security. You know, it's not to be sniffed at. Security is often most noticed when you don't have it. So we shouldn't be too sniffy about Ulro and what he hopes to bring. But nonetheless, it collapses onto what Blake famously called single vision and Newton's sleep. And the sleep there is it doesn't know there's a wider reality. So the downside is it gets caught up in utilitarian calculation, as if that can deliver all. It treats life as abstract, which means that life becomes competitive. You know, much like numbers have to add together or subtract from each other or divide each other. Reality itself is in this kind of competitive calculation. It doesn't really know what love is. It thinks that love is just possessing. And it doesn't really know what imagination is. It feels that we're fated, that we can't be creative at all. You know, it's like Schopenhauer's impersonal will. It's just this kind of drive through life that pushes things on and can't be negotiated with, let alone loved, let alone regarded as part of a creative process. It must be measured, possessed, and controlled. And when people talk about imagination in the sense of something creative, something that is expansive, something that might see the world in a different way, it treats that as sheer fancy. It says it's just your delusions. In fact, it treats consciousness itself as a delusion in its most reductive moments. Now, the good thing about Ulro, Blake said, is that when things become really focused, when a system becomes really feeling like it's captured something and got it all, what it's actually doing is showing up the errors of the system. And immediately you can feel the errors of Ulro. And even the most reductive materialist scientists can't live in the Ulro world because, as sometimes remarked, at the end of the day, they still go home and kiss their children and tuck them up in bed at night. And they don't actually just live by abstraction from reality. And this leads to Blake's second state of mind, which he called generation. Now, if reason rules in Ulro, it's reproduction that rules in generation. It's in the word, he sometimes calls it the vegetative state too, because he thought that it's, in a way, how plant life tends to live. He was thinking particularly the plant life which, you know, when humans leave ruins, quickly takes over the ruins. It has a kind of relentless drive to it. When it is manifest in the human world, it gives rise to his famous dark satanic mills that just, as it were, spread over the landscape, suck up the life around it, even the plant life around it, to produce. I think viruses, you might say, are this half-life that exist in this generation domain as well. That is the soul that shapes them. The virus that will invade the body, multiply, multiply, multiply until it's either killed or kills the body. It's that state of life which he's talking about in generation. In the marketing world of today, the consumer world of today, I think it's kind of brand extension in a way. It's the toothpaste that constantly resells itself, but actually it's still just toothpaste. A slightly more lighter example, but that is generation 2. Now, it has twofold vision for Blake, because it sees itself and the need to survive, the environment it must take control of, the brands that must be extended, the parasite that must occupy another body. And similarly too, in human mental life, when generation goes on, it's the zero-sum game, it's the competitiveness, it's I only win if you lose, it's I must define myself by what I'm against. When the energy's been drawn from that, if you read an argument and feel it's actually is mostly just saying what it's not rather than what it is, that's the generation state of mind. That's a generation mentality, and you can be sure that one way or another it will either create war or will implode on itself. That is what the generation is about. So it's about survival of the fittest. It gets caught up in anger, in blame. Its imagination is mostly about personal survival. That's its kind of soul quality, its inner energy. It's relatively mindless. It certainly doesn't like critique. Blake called it the unfortunate contemplator, the mind that turns in on itself, if you like, and really, as well as being preoccupied, gets most concerned with others out of jealousy and envy. It wants what they've got, and if it can't have what they've got, it will seek to destroy them. It's that kind of quality of mind that generation has. When it disappears into its downside, its upside is that it is generative. It wants to make more. But when it doesn't have access to the higher dimensions of imagination, it falls in on itself. And that was, in a way, another key dynamic for Blake. He realized that generation maybe in itself does have a good side, but it needs to be in the service of more than just its own state of mind, its own demons and angels, if it is to really enrich life and not fold in on life. What generation really needs is a third state of the imagination. We've had all-row reason rules, we've had generation reproduction rules. In Bueller, the third state of Bueller, relationship rules. Now, the word Bueller comes from the Hebrew Bible, the prophet Isaiah, who prophesied that the land will be Beulah. It will be espoused, it will be married to the Lord. And Blake, deeply influenced by lots of Bible imagery, adopted the word Beulah to describe his state of mind, his consciousness, his awareness, his quality of imagination that knows that relationship rules. One of the best places that he explores this is in his Songs of Experience, his famous set of poems. So, for example, in one of them he says, "Love seeketh not itself to please, but for another give its care." Love seeketh not itself to please, but for another give its care. So this is the state where love comes in. It's not just control of all-row, it's not just generation with its desire to reproduce. Love comes in as well. I-it relationships get transformed into I-thou relationships, to use Martin Buber's famous expression. Lovebirds in nature, when you feel the love and vitality of certainly the animal world. I'm perfectly prepared to believe that people are getting into this in the plant world as well, because then generation is serving Bueller. The interest in trees, the interest in fungi. I think this is discovering the Bueller aspect of the natural world, of the environment, you might say, certainly in animal life. In human life, it's about love and human concern. It makes both for blissful rest, the sense of being held and loved. It makes too for romantic energy and passion. It makes for a sense of the soul, that there is an inner life. You know, maybe this is the first state that really believes that there's an inner life, because love enables you to feel that inner life and realize that the quality of an encounter matters much, much more than the quantity that might describe that encounter. So it starts to get a real felt sense of inner life. When you feel that, you know that you're in Beulah. Psychology, therefore, part of it. But it has a downside, because it is threefold vision, not yet fourfold vision. So, for example, in the Songs of Experience, William Blake will both say, love seeketh not itself to please, but for another gives its care. But in the poem that follows that, he says, love seeketh only self to please, to bind another in its delight. Love seeketh only self to please, to bind another in its delight. And this is the downside of Beulah, when it too, a bit like Ulro is how generation can become, Beulah too can become its own worst enemy when it loses sight of the fourfoldness that we need. That is experienced as panic and personal collapse, you know, when romantic love doesn't deliver, when love feels untrustworthy. It's when the love within a group implodes in on itself, and so the group becomes an enemy of another group. It's when empathy, which might reach out, also starts to define enemies, because empathy realizes it can't cure all, whilst it might be able to feel much. And so it's very easy for empathy, the friendship group, to fall into defining enemy groups too. It's why I think ultimately empathy, for all its good qualities, can't save us. And I get wary when I hear people talking about things in that way. It hasn't got yet the fourfold vision. It can fall in on itself. You know, this is where also where moralism, ethics becomes the main goal of religion, as I was mentioning early on. It's right because it's concerned for others. It's wrong because that too easily disappears into a kind of guilt for how you can't help others, for how your own life might be destroying others. And that moralism, Blake called it the moral law. It's risky, as well as having its good qualities when left unchecked. It, I think, can lead to consumption too. The desire to love, you might say, the material world that disappears into the consumption to have more and more of the material world, more and more objects that you feel like you love without realizing that they're extracting from the material world. For lovers of Philip Pullman, who are listening to this and his Dark Materials, you know, Philip Pullman's deeply influenced by William Blake. But ultimately, I think Philip Pullman presents a world which is threefold vision, because he doesn't actually trust the theistic vision that William Blake had. And so in his books, for example, Lyra, she loves, she's passionate, she has a relationship with her demon, with her soul, but ultimately the plot is driven by the need to control, by the need to work out who the enemies are and to defeat the enemies. Beulah, for all its loveliness, for all its romanticism, can fall into this state. So that is the downside of Beulah. You know, when it's about imagination here, it's seen as the desire for a unity, for perfection. It's seen as the desire to join all together in a kind of perfect harmony. And whilst in one moment that can see a lovely vision, it's a vision of love, it's a vision of compassion, ultimately you see that it's a vision that needs to destroy in order to force the unity together. It's a vision that finds imperfection intolerable at the end of the day. So it always risks becoming tyrannical or a bit mindless. That is because it doesn't have the fullness of imagination that Blake really wanted us to develop, which comes with his fourfold imagination that he called eternity. Now, in eternity, imagination itself rules. It's not reason ruling, it's not reproduction ruling, it's not even relationship ruling, it's imagination ruling. The people that get this for him are the artists that put all their effort, all their reason, all their generation, all their reproductive qualities, all their love of the material world even, and of image and of sight. They put it into the service of creation to make something new. So a bit like Van Gogh's sunflowers, you can never look at a sunflower again without realizing the soulfulness and the life that he released within the sunflower, but also created more of the sunflower as well in that artistic effort. I think the revolutionary scientist, to use Kuhn's expression, is in eternity too. Imagination is ruling. You'll remember the story of Einstein discovering special relativity because he imagined what it might be like to sit on a light beam and to travel at the speed of light. It was that playful trust in the imagination that enabled him to see a whole aspect of reality and to create the science, the mathematics with others that could describe it, could really enter into it. So the revolutionary scientist understands this as well. The visionary like Blake clearly orientates their whole life, that all their efforts, all their practice around to revealing it. Someone like Shakespeare, for example, who I think is a visionary as much as an artist, you sense it in Shakespeare because he himself has disappeared into his work. Virginia Woolf made this comment that in Shakespeare, all desire to defeat the competitor, to vent his own frustrations, has been put into the service of the fullness of vision that his plays offer. So we feel we're meeting actual characters when we read his plays or see his plays, and not just Shakespeare's take on the world. Plato too, this is what I discovered in my PhD, was like that. Plato, he appears in his dialogues 3 times and never speaks anything. It's always like Plato was at the door but then left. Plato was there but felt sick, so went home. He's saying that he's dying in his own works to reveal all the creative power that means his dialogues have inspired countless generations, even to now. In short, to be in eternity is to be fully human, all that we might be. So the upside is you get this commingling of will, reason, of generation, reproduction, of love, but it produces more and more and more and more. It has its expansive qualities because, to use the more common expression, is under the aspect of eternity. It sees things from outside itself as well as from within itself and can join those two aspects together. It can die to itself. It's truly free. It forgives all because it realizes that even the mistakes we make, say in Ulro, say in Generation, say in Beulah even, those mistakes are the errors that enable us to see where we've gone wrong and release into the more. So as Blake put it in his summary of Christianity, the one thing that matters in Christianity is the forgiveness of sins, not in the moral sense, because an Ulra-like God will curse you if you don't get forgiven, but because we need to be in a constant state of forgiveness of our sins in order that we can know that we can step freely into more, that we can exercise our imagination. You only learn the virtues of life by making mistakes. And so we're free to make mistakes in eternity. They become the springboards of the more. Death, such a key issue for the modern world now, which so often we get wrong because, like Ulro, like Generation, we feel we need to avoid it. Like Beulah, it's too painful to bear. In eternity, death comes to be seen as the way because it releases you into more. As T.S. Eliot put it, every moment is the time to die. Death is not just a thing that happens at the end of life. When you realize that it's happening in every moment, stepping into more life. That's how imagination, eternity, can conceive of death, reposition death. And similarly, whilst this is not remotely easy, it takes a whole lifetime to grow into. Suffering as well can be seen as the process of change. Often it's only the sufferer that can really say this. And it's when you're a psychotherapist that at the end of a long process, the sufferer might be able to realize that, they might be able to befriend it. I say it very cautiously now, because this is not a moral imperative. This is a realization that might come at the end of a terrible process of suffering. But imagination at least allows for that possibility. It can imagine it in eternity. As a day-to-day practice, it's about learning to lean into your anxiety, not pull back and want to kind of try and control or overcome the anxiety. And it's often best practiced, as the great wisdom traditions have stressed, by noticing the small little perturbations of anxiety every day, leaning into them, realizing that they're actually, well, again, as the Buddhists say, the obstacles are the way. As Blake summarised it, he said, "Man was made for joy and woe, and when this we rightly know, through the world we safely go." And safe because we realise we're always in more life than we know or can be consciously aware of. It's about a kind of surrender in awareness. It's an engaged openness that has realigned, to use the old Stoic Christian word, it's realigned with the Logos, with the divine imperative that runs through all things, sees itself tuning, harmonizing like the Aeolian harp with those things. It's different from Beulah in that it does seek unity, but it seeks unity in diversity. It fully understands the harmony. It has the imagination to see, if you might like to say, the kind of orchestra of life. And that's a real achievement. You know, unity is not remotely a straightforward thing. I mean, it's very easy to think, oh, I get it because we're all the same. You know, what all biological life say. But if you're not careful, you're falling into Beulah's shadow there by insisting that all is just bare life. No, Blake would say that true creativity realizes the diversity and then how everything plays together. It's that diversity and unity. I think Dante got this. If you've ever read Dante's Divine Comedy, you'll know that when he gets into paradise, he's shocked at first because he still sees lots of individual souls. He thinks he's just going to see a kind of divine unity, a divine kind of mist, if you like, a divine undifferentiated light. And he sees loads of individual souls. And then he realizes that those souls are still individuals because they become more and more and more themselves. And as they become more and more and more themselves, their will, their desire, their knowledge, their sight has become more and more part of the whole. You know, their reason, Ulro, their generation, their reproductive capacities, their Beulah, their love has become part of the whole. And so he's living in eternity, in paradise, in imagination. It's a mistake to think that eternity doesn't love the minute particulars, as Blake put it. It's actually Ulro that dislikes the particular in its generalizations, in its abstractions, in its statistics. Eternity loves the particulars because it sees eternity in a grain of sand, as infinity in a grain of sand, as Blake famously put it. It loves too the powers and principalities of this world. It can see, because it's stepped out of its own life, that there's other life elsewhere. It welcomes the imaginative sight of spiritual beings, other powers, the inner soul. It doesn't dismiss them as fantasies anymore. It knows it can be mistaken. Mistakes are fine, but it's prepared to discern and to learn and to gradually live more and more with that wider vision of things, that wider sense of its true life. And so it loves the mythopoetic and the emergent, which I know other people in this series are talking about as well. I think that's why they're such key capacities for engaging with life, because ultimately they move us to imagination. You know, it even has a vision for the economy, because it sees that the economy is not about taking measurements to create a world of those very same measurements. It's about realizing that there can be an economy that serves the right ends. It's the meeting place of all, if you like. In Blake's poetry, like for example, the great epic poem Jerusalem, he even talks about London, the city I live in, and says London is a place of mutual love and harmony when it's living in imagination, in eternity. It's Golgonooza, in his lovely neologism. In Golgonooza, my streets are ideas, my houses are thoughts, my inhabitants affections, and they're constantly wellsprings, constantly generative. In eternity, in imagination. Similarly with the ecology, Blake has an idea which at first can be a bit tricky for the ecology that you often read about, because he doesn't think that ecology is about just cooperating with nature. It's definitely about that. But that is just to exist in a state of Beulah for Blake, because he thinks that ultimately our relationship with nature, nature's relationship with us, has got to be fired by the imagination. It's got to lift us both higher, if you like. You know, when he sees infinity in a grain of sand, that's not just good for us and our vision, it elevates the grain of sand too. It means that in the grain of sand is literally all things as well. And that's the vision of nature, which in a way is a supernature. Is arising through to elevate nature more and more and more. That's the vision which he thinks we should develop when we're thinking about ecology. You know, as he famously puts it, when the sun rises, he just doesn't see a guinea shaped like a circular disc of gold, lovely though that might be. He sees the heavenly host praising God, saying, holy, holy, holy. And the key point about Blake there is that his imagination doesn't read more into the sun, it sees more of the sun. So he can say, lead on, sun, in his vision of ecology, because the sun's light is the light that we all seek. And when we feel the sun on us materially and see the sun in paintings in our mind, we're being led into eternity. That's the vision of nature that he has. It's a consciousness that connects us to divine ends. You know, as he says, he who binds to himself a joy does the winged life destroy, but he who kisses the joy as it flies lives in eternity's sunrise. Beulah, even Beulah, can bind ourselves to a joy but destroy it in that moment. But eternity means that we can kiss the joy as it flies because we trust it will go on and on and on into eternity's sunrise. So the little question is, ask yourself, you know, what state of mind are you in? Are you in Ulro, the imagination that wants to control? Sometimes we find ourselves in that state, especially under stress. Often we find society in that state when it feels the potential for its own collapse. But we must become aware of it to move perhaps into generation. This is the imagination that wants to produce more, but can make growth an end in itself. So watch out for that. Is this growth as an end in itself? That's to get stuck in generation, not to move into Beulah, which has the sense of love, I-thou relationships. But again, be careful when you're in that lovely romantic state, because it might be that you want things to be perfect. You can't tolerate the imperfections. And the reason that they're so wonderful is because Blake put it, you know, contraries release more energy. Carl Jung called it the transcendent function. And it's only when we can tolerate the contraries that we can be released into imagination proper, into eternity. When we see the world as consciously, because we know how our imagination is shaping the world, how our perception is shaped by that. And we're able to be creative with that too as well, because of that consciousness, to make the world renew, which is to rediscover reality in all its fullness afresh as well. Eternity is in love with the productions of time. William summarized it really rather wonderfully. When you're living in eternity, you love time, you love the present, because it makes for the productions that eternity loves as well. So look, just to summarize with a few kind of key, maybe more focused points, having, I hope, given you some sense of Blake's vision of the imagination, and not so much as a system, but as a practical way of existing in the world. Because I think it's that discernment that we need to tune and align ourselves as we move into the future. But here's a couple of practicalities. I think we need to realize, you know, that the material world, this world, cannot bear all the expectations we have for it. In a way, this is capitalism's con trick, that it's deluded us into thinking that our desires can be satisfied by endless material production, by living in generation. But we need to realize that this material world cannot satisfy all our desires once more. But also that we shouldn't stop wanting more. This is where I would disagree a little bit with certainly, you know, the basic premise of the zero growth economists. I think that ultimately that might risk denying something of the human spirit, which is right to want more and more and more. But the trick is not to think that more and more and more can be delivered by any economy, can be delivered by the material world. That is just a part of it. We need to move into Beulah and into eternity. To do so, as well as discerning the states we're in, I think we might do well to pay more and more attention to what the psychologist of religion, Jeffrey Kripal, calls flips. And this is where we suddenly find ourselves in eternity, in imagination. And it's often quite a shocking experience. You know, we think we've had a paranormal experience. We think we've had an NDE. And we think, you know, we might have even been visited by extraterrestrials. Jeffrey Kripal makes a really important point that in these experiences, not actually the content that matters. It's the fact that you've been thrown into a wider world. And actually he thought, and I think this is right too, that many of the great spiritual teachers and they precisely try to induce that experience in us. It's why they tell parables like Jesus did that don't actually have a moral meaning. They are conundrums that are a bit like the Zen koans, flips, these strange synchronicities that we have from time to time. Pay attention to them. Don't love them and the Beulah state too much, but use them to realize that they might become springboards, well springs that can lead you into eternity, with a creative attitude towards them rather than a kind of literal attitude towards them. Similarly, I think we're going to need to rediscover an awareness of the afterlife. If this life can't deliver everything we want, if we flip from time to time into awareness that there's more lives around us than we ever knew, in paranormal experiences, in telepathy experiences and so on, I think also we're going to need to realize that this life is in the service of a greater life, which is also our direction of travel into the afterlife. This was always what people felt before, and the difference now is we can do that even more consciously because of the struggles that we go through. I think this life is about developing the capacities to really experience the next life. That was certainly Dante's vision in the Divine Comedy, that Dante, as he travels through hell, through purgatory, has to see everything, even in its most awful states, in order that then he can experience everything when he enters paradise. And that ultimately happens in the afterlife. I think that is the meaning of our lives now. That'd be my best sense of it, at least right now, that this life, this moment is a preparation, not just for the next moment, but for the next life as well. It does that, though, by developing everything that reason offers, everything that reproduction offers, everything that relationship offers, in order to release us into eternity. Now is a sort of struggle, there's no doubt about it, and we will find ourselves in all row from time to time, desperately wanting its security. We will find ourselves in generation sometime, wanting to grow. We will find ourselves in Beulah, longing for the love, longing for that which we trust and which trusts and love us. But ultimately, I think we must push into imagination. We must do it, I think, by listening. Above all else, our psychotechnologies, our thought, our systems, they must be in the service of listening, which ultimately is an imaginative act. It's taking in and wondering what we hear to hear more and more. And I think William Blake can be a great guide for us. He's worth struggling with his strange words, because in the struggle, he releases what he saw and can welcome us into the divine imagination. That is a quality which I think we need when we're thinking about the religions of the future.